China's ambassador to Canada is accusing this country of, quote, white supremacy. Liu Xiaoye wrote an op-ed in Ottawa's Hill Times newspaper today in which he reacts to Canada's handling of the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou's arrest in Vancouver versus the detainment of two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, in Beijing. According to the ambassador, quote, it's understandable that these Canadians are concerned about their own citizens, but have they shown any concern or sympathy for Meng after she was illegally detained and deprived of freedom? The reason why some people are used to arrogantly adopting double standards, he writes, is due to Western egotism and white supremacy. The dispute with Canada aside, China is the world's most populous country with the world's second largest economy, on pace to top the U.S. economy by 2030. How much power and influence does the country wield globally? Here's Paul Evans, a professor with UBC's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs.
The last 15 years have been the story of global China. China being a visible presence economically, diplomatically, people to people, and in some cases militarily in many, many different parts of the world. Well, for China to seek markets, to seek resources elsewhere, is a natural part of being a global power. What they're trying to do is play it a little bit differently than the United States. It doesn't do these things through alliances. It doesn't do them through formal military relationships. It does them through deep economic interconnections. The Africa part of China's global presence is fascinating because of how fast it's rising, how complex it is. Africa isn't a country, it's a number of different countries. And what China is doing in each of them is a little bit different. Sometimes that's resource exploration and capture, to bring back to China. But it's also about infrastructure, the Belt and Road Initiative, the great Chinese ambition of the last 5 years. Africa is part of that process. And so from a Chinese perspective, Africa is a natural partner. It's different than Southeast Asia. It's different than other parts of the world, but it's one where their economic and now their international influence is being seen and strengthened in important ways. China is building bridges, roads, rail lines in Latin America. It's also playing a new role in Latin America in the multilateral institutions. It's not just China is coming in dealing country by country, but dealing with Latin America as a region. And this, I think, is in part the reason that the United States in particular is a little bit nervous about China's activities in what the United States considers its own backyard. The Chinese view is that it's an open globe. You go where you can, where there's opportunities, where you can do business, where people can move. Moving into the Americas has a little bit of a different geopolitical feel to it. China is not a military player in the Americas, as the United States is in China's backyard in Southeast Asia and East Asia. But it is very clear that they see themselves connecting with those countries in ways that are useful to China's diplomatic agenda at the United Nations and elsewhere, and in this idea of China being the champion of the developing world. It's a developed and a developing country at the same time. And this poses a new kind of challenge to the United States. It's not military, but it is this creeping kind of power, this creeping kind of influence and image that makes many in Washington nervous. China is active in scientific research. They have indicated that as the ice recedes and the waters are more navigable, that they're very interested in it for commercial purposes, not just research purposes. And in that sense, China is becoming a player in our neighborhood. Their intentions are, as always, mixed. I think the view in Ottawa is that, on balance, we can work with China in our Arctic area, in part because they have supported Canadian positions and our territorial claims based on historic use that are not dissimilar to some that they are using in their territorial waters. So China is here. It's in our cities, and it's also in our northern territories, and in an ocean that is, we hope, won't be the kind of conflict point that the South China Sea has become over the last 20 years. As global warming proceeds, as the waterways there become more navigable, suddenly there are whole new routes into eastern North America. There's whole new possibilities for new industries. China is looking at Churchill, Manitoba in new kinds of ways as a port facility and other things, which is part of this huge global ambition of being at the center of many different trading routes, commercial routes, and ones that may ultimately have military significance. But that's not what China's play has been, at least not as yet. Space, the final frontier. Again, it's a combination, I think, of scientific investigation, of advancing Chinese technologies, showing that it has a capacity, developing that capacity to be a major player in outer space. It has strategic implications as well. China's ability to not only put satellites into space, but to knock satellites out of space is something that is of concern to the United States, that wishes to maintain dominance in mid and deep space. So we're into an era where China is a new player on a huge scale, and with the resources and long-term planning frame that allows it to do what the United States had done almost in an unchallenged way for 40 years. China is in space. A country that has risen so fast and in so many different kinds of ways, like China has in the last 15 years, this creates anxiety. It creates uncertainty. How is China going to behave? Is it going to be a new imperial great power? Is it going to be indeed a kind of new model of how a major country should deal with others? There is uncertainty. There's also, because of China's expanding military capabilities, it now has 2 bases overseas. The United States has 430 bases overseas. But China, which had not got into that business before, now has 2 overseas bases, and maybe will have more. So for all of those reasons, everywhere in the world, there is a combination of uncertainty and sometimes anxiety about what China is doing. How you balance that against the opportunities, how you try to shape Chinese behavior, and whether you can shape Chinese behavior, that's what we're debating in every capital around the world.